12 men, 72 hours, 40 kilometers of triple-canopy jungle in central Mindanao that the enemy had owned for years. No helicopter extraction if things went wrong. No close air support on standby. No quick reaction force close enough to reach them in time. Just 12 Filipino Special Forces soldiers, their weapons, their rucksacks, and a mission that the Western advisors at the Joint Command Center had privately assessed as having less than a 50% chance of success. One of those advisors, a senior sergeant from the United States Army Special Forces with 15 years of operational experience across 3 continents, later said something in the debrief that became part of the institutional memory of the Philippine-American Special Operations Partnership. He said, "I have worked with some of the best unconventional warfare units in the world. What I watched those 12 men do in Mindanao was unlike anything I had seen before. Not because of their equipment, because of what they carried inside them." If you want to know what those 12 Filipino Special Forces soldiers found in the jungle, why what they brought back changed the entire operational picture for an ongoing mission, and why seasoned American commanders stood up in a briefing room and started asking questions they had never asked before, then hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and turn on that notification bell before this video goes any further. Because this story has been sitting in operational files and debrief transcripts for years, and it is time the world heard it. The Philippine Special Forces Regiment, officially the Special Forces Regiment Airborne, known within the Armed Forces of the Philippines as the SFR-A, traces its origins to 1962, when a young Army captain named Fidel V. Ramos was given the task of building something the Philippines had never had before, a true unconventional warfare force. Ramos, who would later become a general, then Armed Forces Chief of Staff, then Secretary of National Defense, then President of the Republic of the Philippines, was at that moment simply a captain with a mandate and a vision. He had studied the American Special Forces at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. He understood what a small, elite, deeply trained team could do in terrain that conventional forces could not navigate effectively. And the Philippines in 1962 had plenty of that terrain. The archipelago's interior, particularly in Mindanao, the second largest Philippine island, is dense, mountainous, triple-canopy jungle that has historically resisted every attempt to impose order from the outside. The Spanish never fully controlled it. The Americans never fully controlled it. The Philippine government in Manila has spent 70 years trying to extend effective authority into the southern and central highlands, and the task remains incomplete. Ramos understood all of this. He understood that what the Philippines needed was not more conventional infantry to patrol the perimeter of the problem. It needed small teams of extraordinary men who could go into the heart of the problem and operate there with independence, creativity, and lethality. The Special Forces Combat Qualification course that Ramos established, and that has been refined across 6 decades since, is one of the most demanding military selection and training programs in Southeast Asia. The course runs 26 weeks, not counting the preliminary assessment phases that filter candidates before the serious training even begins. It covers the full range of unconventional warfare skills, small unit tactics in complex terrain, intelligence collection and analysis, communications, weapons handling across multiple platforms, combat medicine, demolitions, language, cultural operations, and the psychological and physical conditioning that makes all of those skills accessible under pressure. But the element of the course that separates it most definitively from the training programs of most other elite units is what happens at the end. The test mission is not a simulation. It is not a training scenario run against other soldiers playing the enemy. The test mission is a real operational deployment in a real combat area against real armed groups that are genuinely trying to prevent discovery and willing to engage anyone who finds them. When a Philippine Special Forces candidate completes his course and takes his test mission in Mindanao, he is not testing himself against an artificial environment. He is testing himself against the actual operational reality that he will face for the rest of his career. Either he performs at the required level, or he does not pass. There is no partial credit when the enemy is real. The American Special Forces officers, who worked alongside their Philippine counterparts during Operation Enduring Freedom Philippines, the 12-year joint counterterrorism mission that ran from 2002 to 2014, consistently noted something in their assessments that did not appear in the headline summaries. They noted that Philippine Special Forces did something that most other Allied forces they had worked with did not do as naturally or as effectively. They did not just operate in the jungle, they became part of it. The distinction sounds like poetry. In practice, it is the difference between a unit that can move through difficult terrain and a unit that can move through difficult terrain without the terrain working against them. Most military forces, regardless of their training, treat the jungle as an obstacle, something to be overcome through effort, through technology, through planning that accounts for every variable the environment introduces. Philippine Special Forces treat the jungle as a medium, the way a fish treats water, not as something it swims through, but as something it inhabits. This is not an accident of nature. It is the product of 60 years of institutional design that deliberately recruits from communities with direct relationships to the land, that trains in actual operational terrain rather than constructed training areas, and that embeds in its institutional culture the understanding that in the Philippine context, environmental mastery is not a supplementary skill. It is the primary skill from which every other skill derives its value. The mission in central Mindanao that this story is built around took place in the early months of a year when the regional security situation had reached a particularly acute phase. A network of armed groups, a combination of elements from the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, Abu Sayyaf-affiliated cells, and foreign-trained fighters who had arrived via the southern maritime approaches, had established what intelligence assessed as a significant logistics and communications hub, deep in the interior of a mountainous jungle district. The hub was not a fixed base in the conventional sense. It was a network of connected positions, caches, communication points, and personnel that moved constantly, but anchored itself around a specific set of terrain features that provided natural concealment, multiple escape routes, and defensible ground. Philippine military intelligence had been working the problem for months. Aerial surveillance had given them fragments. Informant networks had given them fragments. Electronic collection had given them fragments. None of it was enough to produce a clear operational picture. The network was good at operational security. It moved. It changed patterns. It did not use electronic communications in ways that could be tracked. And it had spent years becoming familiar with a jungle environment that punished strangers and rewarded familiarity. To understand the network well enough to disrupt it, someone had to go into the jungle and look. Not from above, not through technical means, not at the margins, deep, for long enough to see what was actually there. That was the mission given to Alpha Team, 4th Special Forces Company. Alpha Team was 12 men. They were led by a captain who had been in the Special Forces for 9 years, and whose operational resume across Mindanao was the kind of record that does not appear in news releases, but that area commanders know by name. His team included 2 communications specialists, 2 combat medics, 2 demolitions experts, a reconnaissance specialist, a language and cultural operator, and the 3 additional riflemen whose roles shifted according to the mission. All 12 had done their test missions in real combat zones. All 12 had been in contact with armed groups before. All 12 understood that what they were being asked to do, penetrate 40 kilometers into the interior of a jungle district that had resisted surveillance for months, establish observation positions, collect actionable intelligence on the network, and then exfiltrate without being detected or engaged, was not the kind of mission where things going slightly wrong had limited consequences. If their penetration was detected, they were too far in for any extraction to reach them before the armed group's reaction forces could. The jungle that would protect them from aerial detection would also slow any rescue. They were going in alone, and they were going in understanding that getting back out was the condition that had to be created by the quality of their own execution. No one else was going to create it for them. The Western advisors at the Joint Command Center reviewed the mission plan and raised concerns in the pre-mission briefing that were, in retrospect, entirely reasonable, given the standard parameters of Special Operations doctrine. 40 kilometers of penetration into enemy-controlled territory with a 12-man team, no standby extraction, a 72-hour timeline, and a mission that required sustained observation from multiple positions simultaneously. This was asking an Alpha team to cover a geographic and operational scope that would normally require at least 2 teams, with more time and more support. The senior American advisor, a Special Forces Master Sergeant who had completed multiple deployments across 3 theaters of operation, told the Philippine mission commander directly, "I understand what this team is capable of, but the timeline and the distance combined with the operational security requirements of the target network represent a level of complexity that I would be cautious about." The Philippine mission commander, a colonel who had his own history of going places that other commanders had said were impractical, listened to the assessment, acknowledged it, and then said something that the American advisor would quote years later in a RAND Corporation study of Philippine-American Special Operations cooperation. He said, "I know this team. The jungle does not know them. That is the asymmetry." Alpha Team went in at 2,300 hours on a moonless night, entering the jungle along a route that avoided the known approach paths that any monitoring force would watch. They moved with the lights off, navigating by terrain association, a technique that requires a level of spatial memory and environmental awareness that cannot be produced by a compass course alone. In the first 8 hours, they covered 12 kilometers. Not 12 kilometers of road or cleared ground. 12 kilometers of canopy so dense that daylight never fully reached the forest floor. Of river crossings that had to be made in silence and in the dark. Of ridgelines that offered no trail and required each man to find his own footing, one step at a time, while carrying a rucksack loaded with everything he would need for 3 days. American infantry doctrine suggests that a patrol in this kind of terrain should expect to cover between 2 and 3 kilometers per hour under optimal conditions. Alpha Team's movement rate suggested they were not operating under the physics that infantry doctrine calculates. They were operating under a different relationship with the terrain. The reconnaissance specialist, a Mindanao native who had grown up in a farming community 2 provinces away from the operational area, and who had spent his childhood moving through jungle terrain before he ever learned what an operational planning cycle was, led the route selection. He did not read the terrain from a map. He read it from the way the ground changed underfoot, from the sound of the trees in the wind above him, from the way the air temperature shifted near the riverbanks and the ridgelines. He navigated by belonging to the environment, not by imposing a course on it. By the end of the second day, Alpha Team had established 3 separate observation positions, covering the primary terrain features that intelligence had flagged as network anchor points. Each position was concealed to a standard that the later debrief described as beyond what the mission parameters required. The team had not simply selected positions that provided coverage. They had constructed concealment that made the positions invisible at distances of less than 5 meters, using natural vegetation, natural drainage lines, and natural sound masking to create observation points that a person could walk within arm's reach of without detecting them. This is not a skill that comes from reading a manual about jungle concealment. It is a skill that comes from years of the jungle telling you when you're wrong and when you're right, and of learning from those corrections until the right answer becomes instinct. What they saw from those positions over the following 36 hours was the intelligence picture that months of aerial surveillance and informant networks had been unable to produce. They saw the network. They saw its composition, its movement patterns, its communication protocols, its cache locations, and its defensive arrangements. They saw who was present, how many, and where they moved at what times. They documented a foreign-trained technical advisor whose presence at the hub had been suspected but unconfirmed. They documented a logistics pipeline that ran from a coastal drop point through 3 intermediate relay positions to the hub. They documented the schedule of the network's senior personnel with enough consistency to establish a predictable pattern. In 72 hours of observation from concealed positions 40 kilometers inside enemy-controlled jungle, 12 Filipino Special Forces soldiers produced the most comprehensive picture of the target network that anyone in the Joint Command Center had seen. And then they exfiltrated without being detected. The exfiltration is the part of the story that the American advisor described in the most detail when he was interviewed years later. Alpha Team had been in the jungle for 72 hours. They had been carrying their full loads. They had been maintaining noise and light discipline for 3 days. They had not slept in a real sense. Rotating 2-hour watch cycles in concealed positions does not constitute sleep at the level the body requires. It constitutes a managed state of controlled exhaustion. Any other team in those conditions would be at a significantly reduced level of operational capability for the exfiltration, moving slower, making more noise, more likely to make the kind of error that gets a team compromised in the final kilometers before they are clear. Alpha Team came out of the jungle at a pace and a level of tactical discipline that, according to the tracker, who was positioned at the exfiltration point to receive them, gave no indication of the 72 hours that preceded it. They moved the same way at the end as they had at the beginning. Because the environment they had been in for 3 days was not one they had been fighting against. It had been one they had been living in. The difference between exhaustion that degrades performance and exhaustion that tests but does not break it is a question of whether the environment has been your enemy or your medium for the duration of the mission. Alpha Team had made the jungle their medium on the first night they entered it, and had not stopped living in that relationship for the entire 72 hours. When they stepped out of the tree line at the exfiltration point, they were tired. They were not broken. They still had their intelligence. They still had their personnel. They still had everything they had gone in with. The Joint Command Center debrief lasted 5 hours. This is not unusual for a mission of this complexity. What was unusual was who was asking questions and what they were asking about. The American advisors, military professionals with years of special operations experience, who had worked with Green Berets, Rangers, SEALs, and Allied forces across multiple theaters, spent a significant portion of the debrief not on the intelligence that Alpha Team had collected, though that intelligence was immediately operational and led directly to a series of follow-on missions that significantly degraded the target network. They spent a significant portion asking about the team's movement techniques. Specifically, they wanted to understand how a 12-man team had moved 40 kilometers in 8 hours through triple-canopy jungle, established 3 observation positions that remained undetected despite the proximity of the network's own security elements, and then exfiltrated the same distance without triggering any of the early warning protocols that the network had clearly established. The Philippine captain, who had led Alpha Team, answered every question fully and honestly. He explained the route selection methodology. He explained the concealment discipline protocols. He explained the sound and movement discipline that the team had maintained for 3 days. And at the end of his answers, several of the American advisors sat quietly for a moment. Not because the answers were unsatisfying, because the answers were pointing at something that no training manual had covered and no institutional doctrine had fully articulated. The answers were pointing at a form of environmental competence that had been built into these 12 men, not just by training, but by a lifetime of being from the land they were operating in. The Rand Corporation's study of U.S. Special Operations Forces in the Philippines from 2001 to 2014, a rigorous, peer-reviewed analysis of the 12-year joint counterterrorism mission, contains an assessment that is notable for how directly it states something that institutional reports often soften into bureaucratic language. The study states plainly that U.S. Special Operations Forces interviewees judged Philippine Special Operations Forces to be among the most proficient Asian Special Operations units with which they had worked. This assessment came from people who had worked with Japanese, South Korean, Thai, Indonesian, Malaysian, and other allied Asian Special Operations units across years of joint exercises and operational partnerships. It came from people whose professional standard of comparison was set by their daily operational context in Afghanistan and Iraq, environments that represent the most intense testing grounds for special operations capability of the modern era. And their conclusion, after working alongside Philippine Special Forces in Mindanao for over a decade, was that Philippine SOF were among the best they had encountered, not in a category of their own, not without caveats about equipment and resources, but in the fundamental competencies that make a special operations unit operationally decisive: small unit leadership, terrain navigation, environmental adaptation, unconventional problem solving, and the kind of sustained commitment to mission success that does not break under the weight of ambiguity and danger. Philippine Special Forces were at the level of the best. The mission of Alpha Team in central Mindanao was not a single exceptional event. It was an example of a consistent operational standard that the Philippine Special Forces Regiment has maintained across 60 years of deployment to some of the most complex and dangerous terrain in Southeast Asia. Since the regiment was founded by Fidel Ramos in 1962 and built through the following decades into a full regimental structure with 6 battalions deployed across Mindanao, the SFR-A has operated in every phase of the Philippine conflict environment, from the communist insurgency of the New People's Army in the highlands, to the Moro separatist conflicts of the south, to the counter-terrorism campaigns against Abu Sayyaf and Jemaah Islamiyah in the post-2001 period. In 2015 alone, Special Forces teams in Basilan overran an Abu Sayyaf base camp and killed 19 fighters, including a foreign operative named Mohammed Najib bin Hussein. In 2019, the 2nd Special Forces Battalion recovered British hostages, Alan Hirons and his wife Wilma, from a jungle area near Mount Salatangan in Zamboanga del Sur, finding them abandoned in the forest after months of captivity. These are the documented, publicly known results. The operational record behind the public events, the intelligence gathered, the networks disrupted, the communities protected, the hostages who came home alive, is vastly larger than what appears in news reports. It is the record of an institution doing its work with sustained excellence across decades in an environment that punishes mediocrity immediately and fatally. There is a particular quality that defines what Philippine Special Forces do in the jungle that is difficult to articulate, but that every allied force that has worked alongside them eventually notices. It can be described inadequately as the difference between operating in an environment and belonging to it. When a Filipino Special Forces team enters the jungle of Mindanao, they are entering a place that many of them know not just professionally, but personally. The SFR-A deliberately recruits from the operational areas in which it operates. There are Muslim Special Forces members recruited from Mindanao communities who bring to their service not just cultural and linguistic knowledge, but a generational relationship with the specific terrain where they will operate. The recruiting pipeline draws people who grew up farming near the jungle's edge, fishing the rivers that run through it, walking its paths before they ever heard the word reconnaissance. When those people are given a Special Forces education, the tactics, the communications, the intelligence analysis, the combat medicine, they become something that no amount of training alone can produce. They become operationally complete human beings, whose professional capability is rooted in a personal, lived relationship with the environment that is the primary condition of their work. That is what Alpha Team was. 12 men, each bringing that combination of institutional training and personal environmental knowledge, moving together with the coordination that comes from years of working together in real operational conditions. The jungle was not their obstacle, it was their advantage. The intelligence that Alpha Team brought back from their 72-hour penetration led directly to a series of targeted operations that significantly degraded the network they had observed. The logistics pipeline was disrupted at 3 points along its route from the coastal drop to the interior hub. The foreign technical advisor was removed from the network. The cache sites that the team had documented were located and neutralized. The movement patterns that the observation had established allowed follow-on operations to be timed and positioned with a precision that pure technical intelligence had never achieved. None of those follow-on operations could have happened the way they happened without the 3 days that Alpha Team spent in the jungle seeing what was actually there. The area commander's after-action assessment, filed with the Joint Command and later incorporated into the RAND study's contextual analysis, described the mission as a model for how deep penetration human intelligence collection should be approached in complex jungle environments. It noted that the team's success was not replicable by any technical means available to the command at that time, and that the capability demonstrated was specifically dependent on the quality of the personnel and their environmental competence, not on any equipment advantage. The mission was cited in subsequent training discussions as an example of what the Philippine Special Forces approach to unconventional warfare could produce when properly resourced and correctly employed. The key word in that citation was correctly. Special Forces are not infantry. They're not sent to hold ground or establish blocking positions or cover a sector. They're sent into the spaces that other forces cannot enter, to do the things that other forces cannot do. When they're used correctly, the results can shock the people watching. Captain Arturo Ortiz was awarded the Medal of Valor, the Philippines' highest military decoration, in 1990 for actions during an engagement with the New People's Army on the island of Negros. He was a Special Forces officer. His citation described actions of conspicuous courage during a direct action operation against a well-fortified enemy position that had resisted previous operations. What the citation describes, in the formal language of military decoration, is a Special Forces captain doing in 1990 what Alpha Team did in the jungle of central Mindanao years later, entering a space that others could not or would not enter, operating with a quality of professional competence and personal courage that produced outcomes that no alternative approach would have produced, and doing it in service of an objective that mattered to the communities the operation was designed to protect. The thread from Fidel Ramos in 1962 to Arturo Ortiz in 1990 to the 12 men of Alpha Team in the jungle of Mindanao runs through the same institutional culture, the same values, the same understanding of what it means to be a special operations force in a country where the terrain is the primary condition of every military problem, and the relationship with that terrain is the primary determinant of every military outcome. The commanders who were shocked by what Alpha Team did in the jungle were not shocked because it was an accident. They were shocked because the consistent excellence of the Philippine Special Forces, deployed in the environment they were built for, doing the work they were built to do, still exceeds what most people who have not seen it believe is possible. Today, the Special Forces Regiment Airborne operates 6 battalions deployed across the length and breadth of Mindanao. The regiment's headquarters is at Fort Magsaysay in Nueva Ecija, where the Special Forces Training School continues to run the course that Fidel Ramos designed, and that 6 decades of operational experience has refined. The test mission is still conducted in a real combat zone. The standard is still that a candidate must demonstrate the competencies that the jungle will actually require, not the competencies that a training range simulates. Muslim Special Forces members, recruited from Mindanao communities, still bring to the regiment the environmental knowledge that makes the difference between a team that operates in the jungle and a team that operates from within it. The joint counter-terrorism mission with the United States ended its formal phase in 2014, but the bilateral training relationships that grew from it continue through Balikatan exercises and other joint programs. American Special Forces, who participated in the OEFP mission and who now work as instructors at Fort Bragg or Fort Lewis, describe their time in Mindanao with a consistent note. They went there expecting to teach, and they came back knowing they had learned. Not just about counterinsurgency in a complex environment, about what a force looks like when its training and its people and its terrain are aligned perfectly, when the institution has been built to produce exactly the capability that the operational reality requires, and when the people filling the institution bring to their professional roles a personal relationship with that reality that no training can manufacture. They went into the jungle. They came back with the mission complete. And the commanders who had doubted it stood in a briefing room in central Mindanao and understood something they would not forget. If this story reached you, if you feel that the men of the Philippine Special Forces Regiment, the 12 soldiers who went 40 kilometers into enemy-controlled jungle with nothing but their training and their knowledge of the land, and came back with the mission complete, deserve recognition beyond the files and the debrief transcripts where their story has been sitting, then please hit that like button below this video right now. 5 seconds. That is all it takes. And it makes an enormous difference in whether stories like this one find the audience they deserve. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell if you want to be there when the next story comes out. Because there are more stories like this one. There are more Filipino Special Operations soldiers who went into places that others said were impossible and came out the other side with the mission done. The Special Forces soldier, who grew up 2 provinces away from his operational area and navigated 40 kilometers of jungle at night by the sound of the trees. The team that stayed still for 36 hours in a concealed position, while the network they were watching moved within arm's reach and never knew they were there. The captain who filed his after-action report and then prepared for the next mission. These men did not do what they did for recognition. They did it because it needed to be done, and they were the people who could do it. The least we can do is make sure the world knows that they exist. Share this video, tell the story, because silence is not what these soldiers deserve.